Hello and welcome back to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. Mark, and we have another person tonight that is not a Mark. Mr. Matt Sekeres joins us on the podcast tonight, guys. Coincidentally, episode 250. I just checked it in the catalog. So, Matt, you're joining us on a very, I guess, an auspicious day, which is really kind of cool. But we got a lot of stuff to talk about, and this is really cool because if you're in Vancouver, you'll know who Matt Sekeres is and his longtime broadcast partner Blake Price. Blake isn't here. Apparently, he was just outside standing on the porch with a microphone, and I told one of the kids to tell him he had the wrong house, but, it got a little bit awkward there. But joking aside, welcome aboard, Matt. It's great to have you here tonight.
Well, Mark, thanks for inviting me. I must say, I was so happy to see that there was F1 digital space and podcast work being done here in Vancouver in my own backyard. So it's awesome to connect with a couple of BC F1 fans, and 250 for you. I believe tomorrow is episode 50 for us of the new show, Sekeres and Price at sekeresandprice.com, and we nearly did 10 years at 1040. So milestones all around, fellas. Congrats.
That's awesome. And likewise, I don't really want to go back and circle back around the traumatic experience that was the sudden demise of Team 1040. But, it's really great to see. You're welcome. But it's really great to see that you and Blake were able to pick it up and, basically pick up where you guys left off, and as did a lot of the other people that were working at 1040 before. So it's really kind of cool, like you say, that we were talking about it just off air just now, that we're finding more and more that there is an F1 community here in Vancouver. But just for the benefit of our audience, because basically we get listeners and viewers from all four corners of the globe, and this is a good time because this is a show that we rely heavily on puns. So this is the time to establish your street cred.
Oh, my.
I know.
Oh,
yeah.
my.
Yeah.
Oh, my.
I know. If you're looking for sophisticated humor, you're not going to get it on this show, I'm afraid.
Gotcha. You've set the tone, Mark.
I have.
I look forward to Hamilton. Good F1 name, incidentally. Look, I've been a fan of the sport almost all my life, like 35 plus years for sure. 40 years here. We're a Montreal family on both sides. My dad's family had a little, they'd call it a chalet. We call it a cabin in British Columbia in the Laurentian Mountains of Quebec, Saint-Agathe, which is right near Circuit Mont-Tremblant, the legendary track up there that has produced so many drivers. Even hosted a couple of F1 Canadian Grand Prix back in the day. So my dad would go to races there. And my grandfather on the other side, my dad's father-in-law, really the only moments of peace that my poor grandmother and mother got between the two of them was when the Formula One race was on, because he was a Brit and he was a fan of motorsport. And so I had influences on both sides, sort of steering me towards the sport. So knee-high to a grasshopper, I went to a couple of Canadian Grand Prix back in the early 80s. I believe Nelson Piquet won one, if not both. And have just followed the sport since. I can go back to the days when I was on heat delay, like late at night on a Sunday night on CBC, and back to the old days on TSN with Vic Router. So it's been really rewarding to watch this. It's more than just an uptick, right? Like it is a pretty heavy surge here of popularity in F1. When you take a look at some of the numbers that TSN is doing now for this sport on a Sunday morning, like early on a Sunday morning in the Pacific time zone, and how it's sort of growing globally and with young people and on social, thanks to Drive to Survive. So amazing time to be an F1 fan right now.
And I have to ask as well, and I don't know if our listeners necessarily have enough context, but you yourself, you've been deeply embedded in professional mainstream sports media for years and decades. From your perspective, because for myself and Mark Daly, we've kind of lived in this cocoon, this F1 cocoon for the better part of our lives. And, we surround ourselves with people that are passionate about F1, so we kind of have this ecosystem. But for us, it seems like that ecosystem now is expanded expanding exponentially. From your perspective, are you starting to see the coverage, the interest permeate the mainstream media? Because for us, we attract people that have an interest because that's our principal responsibility. But from your perspective, what are you seeing?
So you're so right, Mark. Like, I've been involved in Canadian sports media and newspapers and radio for 20 years. And like, I have barely talked the sport on my show. I have barely written about the sport for the print outlets that I work for. And really, when you don't have to go too far back, like, there was very little of F1 in the Canadian mainstream sports media. You know, Journal de Montréal certainly with Jacques Villeneuve, and the French press covered it pretty religiously. I covered a Super Bowl once with a writer from Journal de Montréal named Dominique Fougère, and he used to be on the F1 beat. Like, and I used to say, good God, like, that's the best beat in the world. You travel around the world on somebody else's dime covering these races. You know, Toronto Star did a little bit, and of course TSN, you know, would show the races and maybe even have a preview show. But it's nothing like it is now. And you know, on my show now, I do get people, like, they know I'm an F1 fan now a little bit. So we do get people submitting. You know, we have a lot of audience feedback segments. And we have an audience that likes F1 and will throw things out. So Blake and Andrew, our producer, have had to sort of get a little bit literate about the sport, which I'm not sure they would have had to prior to Drive to Survive. In fact, even Ray Ferraro, one of the top hockey commentators in Canada, has said on our show, my family has all watched Drive to Survive. It's amazing storytelling, and now we're huge F1 fans. So it's been really cool for me to see the conversation increase in volume and in sophistication, and it's also been really cool to see it infiltrate the mainstream media a little bit, you know. But frankly, Mark, I'm not sure it needs the Canadian mainstream media. It's a nice to do, for sure. It's kind of the last frontier, I would say, USA and Canada, in terms of the areas that F1 wants to conquer, that it's not, you know, where it's not already a huge sport, although, you know, there's always China, India is so big. But, I'm delighting in conversations like this. And I'm so pleased to see, you know, a couple of Canadian guys hosting an F1 podcast here in my hometown.
Well, you know, it's so cool too. Like you're saying, the whole Drive to Survive phenomena. We've actually coined the term Gen DTS. We get so many people tweeting us and emailing and getting in touch, and it's just like I watched DTS. I loved it. I found your podcast, whatever. And then I keep getting like phone calls and text messages for people I've literally known my whole life. And they've known that I'm a big sports guy in general, but F1 is probably, you know, one of my top two favorite sports. I'm soccer and Formula One are my two favorites. And I don't know what it is, if it's just a function of the pandemic and people are just going to different content that they would have maybe not have consumed otherwise. Yeah. But I've heard from so many people over the last year that's like, I watched the first season, I've been hooked, and, you know, now I'm on to season 2. And my good friend Jorge, he's from Mexico, who I did the soccer podcast with for years. I mean, he's just like, no football, no hockey, no basketball, no nothing else. It's just soccer. And he texted me the other night. He said, I sat down with my wife to watch season 1 of Drive to Survive, and I binged watched, and now we're on to season 2. He's just like, this thing is amazing. I can't believe what I've been missing. I'm like, well, dude, you know, you've got like a Mexican driver in Formula One.
I thought you had a national hero there. Carlos Slim's favorite investment. Great track, too. Very interesting grandstand. No, you know, like, here's the thing. I'm in an F1 pool at my old work. Like, with the guy who fired me. He's the pool administrator, you know? Like, we text about the race races. And we did shortly after he fired me. So, those sorts of things I never conceived of. And, the other thing that's most encouraging, not that we don't matter in Canada, but we're only so many people, only so commercially viable. Now this Miami Grand Prix is going to join Austin. I saw something really, really intelligent from a marketing point of view a couple months back for the start of the F1 season. Aston Martin got two of ESPN's television radio personalities into their cars in Los Angeles on like Rodeo Drive and things like that. But they picked Marty Smith and Ryan McGee. Marty and McGee. And like Marty and McGee are like two good old boys from Tennessee and North Carolina, right? Like they are NASCAR as they speak and oil comes out. That sort of oil NASCAR. And so they're sort of like, driving around, having fun, top down, shades on in LA as people are noticing them. And obviously understanding, at some point they're in an Aston Martin, and, that's a Formula One team. But, that sort of really smart marketing in terms of how they're going to get the United States on board. And look, I don't know about you fellas, but when I started watching Drive to Survive, I was like, wow, this is, I watched it through an F1 lens, a long time F1 fans lens. I was like, wow, this is amazing storytelling. This is amazing access. This is amazing candor. This is amazing bravery and courage and character development and all the good things, all the things that good storytelling requires. But at no point was I sort of watching it going, this is going to turn F1 into a crossover again. I'd love to hear the two of you on that, because we've now all heard so many stories about I got into F1 because of Drive to Survive, and the pandemic may have been a part of that market. But I did not sort of realize until sort of the build up to season 3 that it had already had such a deep and dramatic effect across a broader segment of the population.
You make such a terrific point, and just to provide a little bit of context for our listeners, I think it's important to kind of look at some of the early numbers that ESPN and TSN have been seeing. So TSN is the national broadcaster in Canada. They're seeing numbers around 520 to 550,000 people per race, plus 20% comp. The U.S. is seeing plus 40, plus 50% comps. They're hitting 1 million viewers per race. Now, those numbers are a little bit skewed because they don't account for the number of people who are watching on legal streams or illegal streams. And let's be honest, there's probably a big segment of the population that's accessing these races illegally, and we're not factoring for that. But I totally agree. And I never imagined when Netflix announced this series, and I think they announced it probably in 2016, 2017, and I remember some of the early kind of background shots of the crews in the pits. Never for a second did I think that this would be anything but an off-season marketing vehicle that would have very, very, very low curb appeal. The fact that it took on this cultural cachet in a way that it has is something that I never would have predicted. Never. And I think a big part of that is, one, the storytelling, whether it's accurate or not, is incredibly compelling. And I think if it was released 20 years ago, the result would possibly have been different, simply because you get to see a snippet of the drivers. But I think the access to the drivers via social media today helps unlock and connect you with their personalities in a way that maybe you wouldn't have been able to before. And I always say that if you look back to 2006, and it was Talladega Nights, the Ballad of Ricky Bobby, or the Ballad of, I can't even remember how to describe it, but the whole concept of that film is you have this pretentious European Formula One driver that comes over to compete in NASCAR against the good old boys. But ultimately, that really summed up the perception of Formula One 20 years ago, which is, you know what, Formula One's a little bit stuffy, it's not accessible, it's a little bit pretentious, they're all white, wealthy, Western European drivers. It wasn't accessible in the way it is now, but I think the combination of the Netflix show, which made it accessible to everybody because everyone has a Netflix account, in combination with social media, has brought in an audience that maybe we wouldn't have seen before. And the really, really important thing for F1 is it's the right demo, right? What we don't want is the Major League Baseball demo. You watch a Major League Baseball game and 60% of the commercials are for lawn fertilizer. That's not the demo you want. The demo that Formula One's attracting is younger and it's vibrant and it has some degree of disposable income. And I think it just goes to your earlier point too about Liberty, right? Like when Liberty bought Formula One, ultimately ultimately they had a couple ways to increase the value of that as a property. You could continue to squeeze your existing race organizers for additional hosting fees. You can put races in new locations, or you can tap in, just like you said, to North America, where they hadn't even scratched the surface of the potential financial.
Well, and Mark, like the thing is here's something that does cross over with my daily line of work covering North American sport. This is the last frontier for soccer as well. This is the last. It is quite simply viewed as a European sport. That is just now really getting any kind of real foothold, and is doing a pittance of the viewership on television that Formula One is now. The other thing relevant to the ratings is that it's on so early in the morning up and down the West Coast and the Midwest. Like, there is a lot of DVR viewing on F1 as well. On top of the people who are watching and live, and in terms of Drive to Survive, like I would argue, Mark, it's because the storytelling was so accurate. Like, because you were like, holy bleep, I can't believe they're doing this story about Alex Albon's mom and going to jail, and like, no, but honestly, like, there were some people in the paddock who opened up some of their deepest, darkest. Like Seb Vettel sitting in the Ferrari driver meeting after having announced that he's moving to Aston Martin, and them having sort of the PR pregame chat. That's the sort of thing I never thought I would see as an F1 fan. And even if you don't know the sport, it was reasonably jarring. Sort of, it's I've heard it called perfect reality television, and I think that's right, because it's F1 has always had flair. It's always had glamour. F1 has always had flair. It's always had excess. It's always had excess, and it's always had spoiled brat drivers to some degree, and the feuds therein. So it's sort of been a perfect. It's been a perfect kaleidoscope of sort of things that appeal to the North American audience now. And like in preparing for this pod, I was thinking about it. Guys, like I think there are going to be some significant investments from Liberty and from some of those auto manufacturers and some of those drivers, and just everything about Formula One. I think is going to invest pretty heavily here in North America over the next few years, because I think this is the area, this is the corner of the globe with the U.S. that has the most growth potential, and quite frankly, the U.S. is still the economy that you want to be deeply embedded in.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great place to leave it for the moment. We're going to take a short break here. When we come back, I've got a bunch of other things, including an email from our favorite listener, Bitter Brad in Pittsburgh. He's got a question for us. So we'll do that right after the break. So don't go away. We'll be right back. All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. And Mark, you seem you've refreshed yourself. I guess you're all ready to go. But just before we dive into the mailbag here, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Matt was talking about just before the break. And the one thing that I totally agree with. I agree with basically everything Matt was saying. But the storytelling is so compelling. But there's one thing that I don't know if this really has been mentioned too much, because when the series first came out, I thought for people like us that were already very invested, very interested in Formula One, I thought this was niche content, and it didn't really necessarily take off in the first season. It's kind of, it's been a bit of a slow boil, but especially since this last season came out, it's been exponential in the growth. And it really is kind of interesting too, because the people that produced it, the Box to Box Films, they also did that documentary about Ayrton Senna that came out, well, it's at least 5, 6, 7, maybe even 8 or 9 years ago, and basically detailing his entire life and up to his tragic death at Imola in 1994. And the storytelling in that film is just as compelling and just as good, because when I watched that film, and I've tried to watch it a couple of times, that I've gotten to the point where they retell that tragic weekend at Imola when first we lost Ratzenberger and then we lost Senna a day later on race day. The storytelling is so good, and the way that the film is done, that the emotions get very, very real. And the Paul Martin's the director, that he's obviously very talented in telling all these stories. And what I find so fascinating about DTS that he's pulling on all these different threads, and he's able to sort of keep them going across multiple episodes and kind of tease you, even though there might be one specific episode, like Matt was just saying about about Sebastian Vettel and the whole move to Aston Martin, which I think was nicely summed up by Christian Horner, who said it's like breaking up with your girlfriend, but she's still living in your house. Which I thought was an interesting comment. But Mark, you would put a tweet out on our Twitter feed earlier today, and this is something that we've been talking about a little bit ourselves, and I think it works into nicely with an email from Brad, because there was a little bit of context for Matt. Last week on the show, Brad had sent in an email questioning about the use of PEDs in Formula One and stuff like that, and so then Mark, seeing that he's from Pittsburgh, immediately went to the lowest common denominator and drag Barry Bonds into the conversation. So that's where it kind of went. Anyways, Brad, he starts off his email, or ends it, and saying that Barry Bonds can suck it, which I think everybody can agree with. But anyways, the question that he was bringing up is just in relation to the new cars, the new regulations that are coming into Formula One for 2022, just kind of taking a look in the rearview mirror, another nice little, corny metaphor there. He wanted to know, from the perspective of the cars, which is the best era of Formula One in our opinions. I'll start off with mine. I particularly like the sort of the late 80s, when you had like the McLaren Honda, the Williams Honda, the MP44, the FW11, all those sort of really classic, like the Nigel Mansell, Nelson Piquet, Senna, Prost at McLaren. But, I realized at the same time that those teams, well, I guess it's no different than maybe the dominance we've seen of Mercedes over the past several years. But I mean, they were very, very dominant in those years. But I think for me that I tend to look at this maybe from more of a nostalgic and sentimental point of view, perhaps from the sporting side of it, when they got into that sort of Goldilocks zone, that this era from 1990 to 95 or 1960 to 1970, whatever it might be, where the cars and the regs were really spot on. I'd be interested to hear what either of you think on that topic.
Certainly when, the 80s and the era you talk about. Certainly when, the 80s and the era you talk about with that whole gang, Prost and Mansell and that whole gang. It was a more difficult car to drive. Who are we kidding, right? Like, that was when you're manually shifting and all of that. I mean, that to me, that was sort of perhaps a bigger test of the driver. To me, that was sort of but if we're just talking about the cars, and not just aesthetically, because what I always tell someone who doesn't know Formula One racing is the sound is just as incredible as the look of the car. And the other thing, of course, they don't know is it's not just the way these things accelerate. It's the way these things brake. And, having spent many a Canadian Grand Prix in the casino hairpin there, to watch them enter that corner, the first few times, it's like your eyes are deceiving you. Like, you legitimately think that the car is running into the gravel through the tire barrier and into the stents. Like, that's how fast it's going before it hits So I would say right now they have the best combination of look and aesthetic, and that includes livery. Just the way they maneuver is so sleek. Now it's beautiful. It's a little less ragtag, sliding around a little bit as they used to. Although that has its value too. Back in the day, when someone was really on some bad tires and just throwing the car all over the track. But about 10, 12 years ago, I went to a couple of Canadian Grand Prix, and you had to wear the earplugs. And then they went to the hybrid engines, and I missed it one year. My dad went, and he went, "It's terrible. I'm never going back again. They sound like go-karts, right?" We went a few years ago. We went 2019, I guess it was. And to me now, it's the perfect sound without being so ear-piercing that you have to put the earplugs in. The perfect look, the perfect maneuverability. Like, I watch them now, and I go, to some degree, this is the sport aesthetically and acoustically at its optimum. This is the sport aesthetically and acoustically at its optimum.
Yeah, the very first race that I went to was the 2001 European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. And we were there for the entire weekend, but there was nothing like seeing the cars come down the hill into the hairpin on that very first lap. And I went with about we went with a big group. I think there was about 8 or 9 of us, and you were all sitting there, and we're all a big group of friends. So you're sitting there chatting, and of course, when the race starts, you've been talking to your buddy next to you, and you forget to put your earplugs in. And as soon as they came down into that hairpin, and as soon as they put the foot down on the accelerator, the shrill noise from the however many cars there was that year, 20 or 22, whatever it was, almost 20 years ago. It was painful. It was literally painful. And we were all fumbling for our earplugs very, very quickly. And then my wife and we went to the Spanish Grand Prix.
Mark, you dragged her all over the planet to race
the new era.
I can see where this is going, Mark. All over the planet I can see where this is going, Mark.
Yeah, she's let's just put it this way. I'm a very lucky guy. She clearly came off as the worst of the deal. But the thing was, that weekend I never put in the earplugs the entire 3 days that we were at the track. It was amazing contrast.
It's supposed to be, if you go live, it really should be a sensory overload experience. Like, that's what you're paying for. And the tickets aren't cheap if you're going for a weekend. Like, that's what you're paying for. So you should be stimulated, your senses, in ways that they're not stimulated in other places. And to me, that's what's so great about sitting in a hairpin or sitting in an area where you see them decelerate to as slow as they're going to go into an area where they're up the gears and accelerating to as fast as they can go. Like, coming in the hairpin now in Montreal, they sound like spaceships. Like, it's an aviation noise. It's a jet engine noise on the way in and on the way out. So, it's just marvelous. Like, I've had a lucky career in sports media where I've got to travel, certainly our continent, but a fair part of this world as well, going to different sporting events. And so I'm a little bit numb to a lot of the mainstream sports that are out there in the live experience. Formula One is the one that I still have. Sorry, guys. Formula One is the one that I still, it stirs something in me that the others don't. It stirs something because there are some machines on track.
Yeah, that's very,
very skilled. Yeah. Pilots who are doing things that it's really hard to conceive of. Your brain can't really process it all, and you're processing it for days to conceive of. Your brain can't really
you make such a great point about that, and this is a question we get from a lot of our listeners is, hey, we're new to F1, I want to take my family, I want to take my girlfriend, I want to take my boyfriend to an F1 race this year, what should I expect? And I remember back in 2016 in September, my wife and I went to the MotoGP Grand Prix at Silverstone in the UK, and one of the Hamilton
has been dragged around the world too, huh?
Hey, we named our son Lewis.
All right.
There's a common theme going on here.
That should show you how deeply F1 runs in the family. But we went to the MotoGP race, and the sound and the sensation of those bikes, it rippled through your core. And we went to the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, the finale of the F1 season in 2016, a few months later in Abu Dhabi, and we're sitting in the primary grandstands immediately across from the garages, and the sound couldn't compare. Like, I liked the sound, but it wasn't that sensation. But we were back at a Grand Prix in 2018, and they'd done some revisions between the 2017 and 2018 season because there was so much negative feedback about what they'd done to the experience of F1 that it was back again. It was a completely different experience. I'm like, this is what I'm paying for when I'm sitting in a corner, when I'm sitting at Club Corner at Silverstone, and I've got these cars attacking in the corner. I need to feel that, and my whole core needs to vibrate as those cars pass, and it was great that sensation was back.
Yeah.
Needs to vibrate as those.
I mean, all I have to say to that is, when you guys want to lend me the private jet to go over to Silverstone and Nürburgring, Abu Dhabi, I'm in. If you want to invite your old buddy Matt, I'd be happy to come. All I do is take Air Canada from Vancouver to Montreal once every June. All I do is take Air Canada from Vancouver to Montreal once every June. Yeah, but
don't worry, we'll make a few phone calls. We'll set it up. No problem.
Over the years. Honestly, I've covered a number of events down there. It used to be a sort of a regular vacation spot for me, and I still have family that winters in Miami. In fact, I was just there a couple years ago, before this whole pandemic. What a magnificent spot for F1. And I'm familiar even with the course or near the football stadium. I've been in that football stadium a number of times, and it's tremendous because it's huge parkways that encircle, an 80,000 seat football stadiums in what is really not actually that dense an area by Miami standards, population wise. So I really look forward to this race. I've been meaning to get to Austin. We were going to go to Austin this October. Alas, everything blew up. But I look forward to going to Miami, and Austin for me has, as much as it's not really a Texas city, it's kind of been a little bit of a clunky fit with F1. It's not on brand, if you will, with Formula One. There are some there's some significant differences between Texas and F1. So it's been neat seeing those two cultures sort of collide a little bit. And I do like the track for the on-track excitement. There's been a lot of pretty good passes and racing there, but Miami is way more an international city, right? Like, Americans don't see well outside their borders. That is not something America does very well. But Miami is such a melting pot, a place where you hear Spanish before you hear English on the streets, that I think the F1 world is going to get to Miami, and I think that's going to be just a marvelous success in terms of having fans congregate on what is typically a pretty hot vacation spot and sunny destination to begin with, but also a city that has glitz, has glamour, has panache, but also a city like Miami does. So I've told my girlfriend that's our next trip. So maybe Mrs. Daly and Mrs. Hamilton can have some company down there. We've got a couple of Daly and Mrs. Hamilton can have some company.
So now the question is going to be: is it going to be your private jet or ours? So we got some details to work out here. Yeah. All right. Let's take a quick break again here, guys. And then I do want to go back and Mark, I know you're just chomping at the bit there to talk about your proposal that you have for Liberty Media and this whole concept that we've come up with majors for the Grand Prix circuit. Anyways, we'll do that in just a moment as we take a quick break here. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Okay, well, welcome back to the show. You're with Mark and Mark, Daly and Hamilton, and also joining us is Mr. Matt Sekeres from Sekeres and Price, and we're talking Formula One. And Mark, we talked about it, or you actually kicked off this conversation on Twitter this afternoon, and so maybe you should take it from here. This is something we've tossed about, and we've talked amongst ourselves on the show previously, just the whole introduction of the sprint races that are coming in, and this concept that you have of making several premier weekend events throughout the calendar, basically majors like you might see, say, on the Pro Tennis Tour. And well, I don't want to steal your thunder. I've got a couple of opinions of my own, but why don't you take it and then we'll weigh in on the discussion.
Right now is the ownership body in Liberty. I think Formula One in so many ways was being held back and really strangled by Bernie and his group. And one of the things I have to credit Liberty for is opening up the sport, making it more accessible, embracing social media, but they're also willing to try things on and off the track that I don't think the sports necessarily would have entertained in the past. And we're talking about things like qualifying sprints and all of those different kind of concepts. But one of the things that I think could potentially be really important for this sport is it needs to find a way to create an event or multiple events that transcend the calendar. And you see this in golf. You see this in tennis. You have certain, like, we all know what the four majors are in golf. You probably don't know the rest of the calendar unless you follow the PGA. Likewise, the broad sports community probably can pick out the four majors in tennis, but they probably couldn't kind of point out any of the other events on the tour. And one of the things that Indy does really well is, even though the bulk of its calendar, it's ovals, it's super speedways, it's road courses, even though in the eyes of most American consumers, sports consumers, it's pretty irrelevant. the Indy 500 event transcends sports. It transcends motorsports and it transcends sports. And it brings in an audience that you would probably never expect to see in that championship. And one of the things that we've been kicking around the last couple of months is how could or what could Formula One do to try to replicate that experience? And we've been talking about this concept of, identifying four majors. The benefit to Liberty is, hey, look, if you want to host a major, you need to bid big dollars. You can charge big dollars, but you get some really cool benefits. You know what? You're going to have the exclusive access to a qualifying sprint race. You're going to have access to awarding double the championship points, so it means more to the teams. Like, you could do some really cool things with this. And then all of a sudden, from a marketing and a branding perspective, you've got 4 events that you can build your calendar around. Because what we've seen the last 6 or 7 years is there's some great races in the middle of the summer, but it's usually the dog days of Formula One at that point. The championships decided there's nothing compelling. But what if you were able to identify 2 or 3 or 4 races, brand them as majors, double the championship points awarded with them? What could you do with that from a marketing appeal to kind of broaden the exposure of the sport? But yeah, that's something we've been talking a lot about, especially in light of the Indy 500 last weekend, which was a blockbuster success by any standard.
Well, Mark, I love it.
Blockbuster success by any standard.
You know, as you were speaking about it, I found myself nodding my head, yes, yes, yes. And by the time you got to the end of it, it was so good. I was wondering when you were going to get a job with Liberty Media. Mark was so good. But the other thing that that ran through my head as you were explaining it, and maybe this is because of my position being on talk radio here in Canada for the last 10 years, we are oftentimes guilty or at least accused of seeing things through a North American sporting lens. Now, the PGA Tour, I think it would certainly be through a North American sporting lens. That said, tennis Grand Slams, they touch the world, right? London, Paris, New York, and Australia. They touch the world, right? London, Paris. I love the idea of double points for quote-unquote major races. I think we all know Monaco has to be one of them. Quite frankly, I think Monza has to be one of them. We all know Monaco has to be one of them. I would nominate Spa. I think Spa is the best racetrack in the world. But I'm not sure if the Belgian countryside would resonate as much with the less than hardcores, with the softer audience. But no, I'm with you. Every sort of event is its own equal entity, although I suppose Monaco has a little bit more cachet. I suppose Silverstone has a little more cachet, just, because the way we've always consumed it over here in Canada is through the lens of British broadcasters like Murray Walker. Because the way we've always consumed it over here in Canada is through the lens of British broadcasters. I'm giving them 2 thumbs up, Mark Daly. I loved everything I heard. I thought it'd be marvelous. Mark Daly. I loved everything I heard. I thought it'd be marvelous.
Yeah, my only additional take on what Mark was saying was that I love the idea that he's come up with. I think that if you're going to have like these major events, you've got to make them regional. You have North America, South America, Asia, the Middle East, so that each geographic region has one. And then I think that one of them, you have to make it the U.S. Grand Prix. I mean, if you can see, if Miami has that potential, maybe, they get some other tracks in there in the future. Maybe you have some rotating thing. I mean, it seems that they want to at least have 2 races in the United States. So I think that from a media point of view,
symmetry there, and I hear what you're saying. It probably should be around the world, given
that has a lot of potential there too. And it is interesting.
Symmetry there, and I certainly wouldn't want to turn a Grand Prix I haven't seen yet and has a short history into a quote unquote major. I certainly wouldn't want to turn a Grand Prix I haven't seen. Like Austin, I'm not sure it's worthy. Can I throw our hat in the ring for Ile Notre Dame in the basin of the St. Lawrence off Montreal, Quebec, Canada? Because it's one of the great tracks on the F1 calendar. It produces drama. It produces unique winners. It produces all sorts of, to me, it's kind of the perfect balance between the new tracks and the huge runoff areas and tire barriers and the danger of a street course, even though it's not really a street course, it's a permanent circuit. I mean, look, I think it would even be a great debate marketing tool to get the get conversation starting on which ones should
look,
be
I think
the four majors. So I think you'd even have the lead-up marketing up until where you give fans the opportunity to sort of feel like they're there as part of the construction and the birth of this majors idea. Sort of feel like they're there. Yeah, no, fantastic. And the birth of this majors idea.
Yeah.
Grand plans. Yeah, no, fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting too the way that you sort of framed it, the way that we view sports from a North American point of view, because a lot of the questions that we get from listeners, especially people that are new to Formula One, is that they can't really wrap their minds around the whole idea of dual championships. It's just like, okay, well, what's the difference between the Drivers' Championship and the Constructors' Championship? Okay, well, obviously one's a team one and one's a driver's one, but how can I equate that to, say, North American sports? And then I always say, I guess the best way that you could look at, say, the Drivers' Championship is something like the Heisman or the Cy Young or like an MVP award, whereas the Constructors is like the Super Bowl or like a championship series.
And there are fundamental differences between sort of European sports structure and North American structure. Structure. They do a table, right? Their season is the championships. We do a regular season, then we go on to a playoffs for the championships. Right? There are clearly some things about Formula One that a North American audience has to wrap its brain around that isn't, reflexive. But I don't think there are bridges. I don't think these gaps are too far to bridge by any stretch. But I think it's reasonable, particularly now with the point system. I think it's a whole lot easier to follow the sport. From a North American point of view than it was in the past. I think it's a whole lot.
Matt, let me ask you a question. Just while we're on the theme of North Americans and North Americans coming into the world of Formula One, how critical or special do you think it is that we live in this moment right now where we have not one, but two full-time Canadian drivers on the grid? And if you flash back, the last time we had a driver was JV. He kind of flamed out in 2005 after a bunch of, I don't want to say ill decisions, but bad collaborations with teams and engine issues and all kinds of pieces. And his career kind of flamed out. But we're in a position right now where we have two Canadian drivers. They're both very young. They both obviously come from strong financial backgrounds, but from a personality perspective and a charisma perspective, they're both such great guys. How important do you think that is to the future of F1 in Canada?
Well, obviously Mark would help if they were on podiums from time to time, and I don't think that's realistic for Latifi right now. I was hopeful it was more realistic for Lance than it has been through 5 races so far this year. Although I do have hopes there, and I'll get back to that in a second. I mean, let's face it, the sport in our country is 2 names, 1 family. Gilles and Jacques Villeneuve. Without those two, I don't think the sport comes close to resonating as much as it has in this country. And you're right, Mark. I was looking at some F1 driver related the other day, just astonished to see 2 Maple Leafs there, right? Because you saw 2 German, if you saw 2 Union Jacks, even if you saw 2 Australians, you would bat an eyelash. But to see 2 Canadians of a very select few, 20 in the world, it is quite remarkable. Here's what I'll say. I think Lawrence Stroll is as important and influential a figure for the sport in Canada as Lance Stroll is. Because here's the thing. Lawrence has all kinds of swag. I mean, Lawrence is absolutely in the vein of Flavio Briatore and some of the Ferrari principles over the years. The big, outsized personalities, right? Even to his drive, a couple of friends and I like to parrot his line and drive to survive back to each other. I'm the chair. You've got me till 12:30, as he checks his Rolex. Lawrence is an enormous figure. And if his team started to do better, and let's face it, he wants to win yesterday. If his team did better, I think he would be just a marvelous marketing tool in our country. Because, here's the thing. It's perfect in English, perfect in French. He's, so to speak, paid the dues now, buying out a team. Like he's invested in this sport. Ferrari collector, so he's got a lot of things going for him, both for the dyed-in-the-wool F1 fans, but also people who are newer to the sport. But that's barring Lance winning. Like if Lance were to win, with his charm and good looks, and his personality, and he's articulate in both languages. If Lance were to win, that's a Canadian sports superstar and an enormous marketing tool. If Lance were to win, that's a Canadian sports superstar and an enormous marketing tool for the sport.
It's funny when I look at Lawrence and when I look at Lance, I'm immediately intimidated by Lawrence Stroll. I mean, we watched that one clip in DTS where they're sitting in the factory there, and just the way that his eyes are literally boring into every single person he's talking to, or just he's digesting every single bit of information. But then when you see Lance, he's like every regular 20-something-year-old Canadian kid, he's very relatable. And then at the same time, it's just like I look at Lawrence and I'm just like, I can totally understand why this guy's like the alpha male billionaire, uber successful in everything he's done. It's just like he has that completely different vibe. And I'm sure that he had that sort of
Lance could fit in a hockey dressing room,
about 2 years old, when he probably
he'd be one of the more outgoing hockey
whatever
players,
it was.
More upbeat. He'd always be interviewed on Hockey Night in Canada.
100%, yeah,
because they love his enthusiasm. But Lawrence just commands. Like I can only imagine how much Lawrence commands a room when he walks in. He's an all eyes on me type of guy, right? So if they were ever to have any success, there's a natural successors to the Villeneuves in some regard, right? As the first family, Canada's first family of F1. They're the natural successors.
It's so important to remember as well. And I'm just looking at his profile right now. Lance is 22.
Yeah.
This is his fifth year in Formula One. And I think really the way I kind of put it to this for new Formula One fans, because he skipped Formula 2, right? He won the Formula 3 championship. He skipped Formula 2. To me, he kind of skipped college. He's like that NBA player that goes straight to the NBA out of high school. I know he's going to spend a couple years on the bench, getting his reps, learning. But now he's in this great package. And to your point, Mark and I were very excited coming into the season, thinking that Aston Martin was going to be able to build on what Racing Point had last year. And for a number of technical reasons, they're not there yet. And hopefully Monaco's a bit of an inflection point, and maybe things will start to turn. But he's still 22. He's still so young, and I still think he has tremendous runway. And to be honest, your point about his dad is phenomenal in the sense that long after Lance is out of the sport, Lawrence will either be running a championship team, or I could see him running the sport. Do you know what I mean? Like he's got that personality where he could run Liberty.
Yeah, and he loves it. And he's got a little bit of that fear factor, like Bernie, although in a much bigger body. And he loves it. And he's got a little. Well, I imagine he's physically intimidating as well a little bit. Lawrence body. Mark, I hear your point about Lance, and I'm with you, and I'm with both of you. Like they are effectively Lawrence. Canada's team, if you will. Lance, and I'm with you, and I'm with both of you. I drive a Jaguar now, and if they were to happen to bring Jaguar back, maybe I'd be a Jaguar fan. But for right now, Aston Martin is Canada's team. If they were to happen to bring Jaguar back, maybe I'd be a Jaguar fan. But what was I going to say? Aston Martin is Canada. Here's the counterpoint, Mark. And Lance 22. How old's Max? 23. What was I going to say? How old was Lewis when Lewis started winning? Lance 22.
He was winning titles at 22.
Yeah. How old was Seb when he started?
Pretty close to
winning. When Lewis started winning. So do the really special ones now separate themselves by 22, 23? Right? Yeah. So and I hope it's not true. Like I hope Lance graduates and is like Nico, is like a late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah, that becomes
world champion and best in class. But I sort of get the sense now, the way the sport's going, particularly the way we're filling driver spots, that if you're one of the special ones, you're going to get into a cockpit pretty early where you can win. Lewis did, right, in 07. And, that wasn't very typical. A lot of them had, Seb worked his way up. But, Lewis got into, it was a McLaren, if I'm not mistaken. in 07, right? And I remember I was on Toronto radio the weekend before the Canadian Grand Prix, and I said, look, there's a new superstar in this sport, and it's a man of color, and we have never seen that in Formula One. And I have a feeling that he's going to win this weekend in Montreal, in the new world, in the world where we're immigrants from everywhere, right? Where everybody comes together, where we have this multicultural harmony in Canada. And Lewis won that weekend, and Lewis has won North America a whole lot, and it's really started a love affair with Lewis in North America. So, he is the alpha dog, and I think he has tons of fans over here. And north of the 49th parallel, I think that's true as well right now. And until Lance wins, I think it's hard to compete with Lewis Hamilton. Especially when you have good Canadian boys from Vancouver naming their children Lewis Hamilton while carrying the surname.
Absolutely.
Especially when you have good Canadian boys from Vancouver naming their children Lewis Hamilton while carrying the surname.
Well, my oldest son's name is Brock, and I keep telling him, he keeps asking me, even though he's 12, he keeps asking me, did you name me because of Brock Besser? And I just say yes. Even though that, he was born long before Brock Besser joined the Vancouver Canucks. But, that's a different story for a different day. We're going to take one final time out here, guys. Matt, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about Monaco. We got a race this weekend. So we'll talk about that in the break here and as we go into our final segment. So, guys, don't go away. We will be right back. All right, Mark. So we have gone through the mailbag. We've got some tweets.
So it's time to do that now, right, Mark?
Any one of our listeners so far. So we're doing pretty good, for this week, but we still have one segment to go.
That now, right, Mark?
Well, we're trying to keep everybody on side. I think we've done a pretty good job so far. But Matt, I wanted to throw it back to you because when we were talking before we jumped on air tonight, you said you wanted to, you feel obligated to talk about Monaco, and I know this is
I saw all the chatter. I had people tweeting at me.
It's still fresh in our minds because we just were there only 2 weekends ago.
About Monaco. I saw all the chatter. I had people tweeting at me. I was like, people texting at me. You mad, bro? Like, what's with all the hate here on Monaco? I suppose it caught me a little bit off guard because you mad, bro? I'm so busy following all the other sports for my job that I don't always follow the minutiae of the F1 discussion. I'm so busy following and particularly the sort of inside F1 discussion of the cognoscentic and the sharps. But I was surprised to see how many of our listeners here in Vancouver, Canada, were messaging me about how terrible Monaco is, and there's no passing, cars are too wide now, qualifying is the only thing worth watching, and were messaging me about how terrible Monaco is. And maybe I'm old school and nostalgic, but I'll say a few things. Number one, I've seen you guys retweet all the tweets that really render this discussion moot to some degree. Monaco is too significant to the sport from an economic and from a brand standpoint to go anywhere. F1 has, always sold glamour, and there is no more glamorous place than Monte Carlo, Monaco. So, to the extent this whole discussion is moot, there are two chief areas where I still really look forward to and love Monaco and have it on my list of Grand Prix I want to go to when you lend me the private jet. Even though I know I could probably buy a house in one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world here in Vancouver, with what it will cost me to do this race properly. Even though I know number one is relatability. One of the most expensive real estate markets. A lot of these new tracks, and for safety reasons, but for also racing reasons, are big and wide and have the huge runoff areas. And for safety reasons, and gravel pits and tire barriers can only be so relatable. And wide. When you're racing around Monaco, and gravel pits, virtually every camera frame is relatable to viewers, and relatable in a sense that it's it's fantasy. It's virtually every. I could never afford to shop in that kart shape, but look, there's a kart shape. There's casino. right there. Look at the yachts in the marina. I can name you virtually every turn at Monaco, from Saint-Devat to Beau-Rivage to Massenet to the hairpin, Nouvelle Chicane, on and on it goes. I can't name you more than a couple of corners at every other track, and only the good ones too, like the Parabolica and Eau Rouge, Champions Wall, and that sort of thing. So there's a relatability for just human beings, but particularly new fans with Monaco, that you just don't get with big, wide runoff areas, gravel pits, and for just human beings, but particularly new fans. The second thing is, Murray Walker used to say about Michael Schumacher, he's millimeter perfect. The second thing, when he pulls into the pits, he's not near his marks. He's millimeter perfect on those marks. That's when they used to have to bring the big fuel hose, as you remember, and fill it up. So where you stopped in that pit was very important. I feel like we've taken a little bit of the precision craft out of the driving. So where you some of the bigger, wider tracks was very important. And Monaco, for me, has the perfect balance of requiring that precision skill, that you want to cut it thin but not too thin. We saw Latifi hit the wall at the swimming pool, right, in qualifying. We saw pole sitter Charles Leclerc cut the corner too tight at the swimming pool and break the Ferrari. We saw pole sitter Charles Leclerc. I love that element still to racing. You sort of need to be perfect around that corner 64 times, or however many laps there is. I love that element. And the best part about Monaco is it's sort of guilt-free because they're never really going fast enough that you fear a heinous accident that if he gets it wrong there, we're all going to see a scene that we don't ever want to see. Like, I love Eau Rouge. I think it's the best corner in race. But holy bleed, a couple of years ago when Hubert, was it? Antoine Hubert went off at that corner. Holy bleed. That's something as a racing fan that I just don't ever want to see. Like, nobody should die for this sport.
Yeah.
That said, there should be a danger. There should be a fear factor in this sport. That's how we separate some of these drivers. And for me, Monaco has that. It's tight. You got to be perfect with the car. That's how we separate. And look, I saw the graphic about how much longer and how much wider an F1 car is compared to the 70s and 80s. When we were racing the same streets in Monaco. I saw the graphic about, and I get it, how much longer, and it's going to be harder to pass, and I don't want to really hear the complaining from every driver in the paddock. There are places that you can do it. Max and others have shown. You put pressure on a leader, he may screw it up through the Nouvelle Chicane, and you're going to be able to take the lead. The pit strategy is still there. I'm willing to deal with one race a year where we're not seeing passing the plenty or even a lot of opportunity for passing the plenty. Given the flip side, given the intangibles that Monaco brings to the table, where we're not seeing passing the plenty or even a lot of opportunity for passing the plenty. I could tell Mark, we're sitting there watching me, and I'm like, he's listening.
Yeah,
he don't agree.
It's not my
Hamilton looked like he shook his head a couple of times, but I feel like I was talking to. That wasn't the preacher to the choir right there. I'm quite sure by your reaction. I feel like I was talking to. That wasn't the preacher to the choir right there. I'm quite sure by your reaction.
Yeah, no, but I totally agree from the spectacle point of view. And the other thing too is like you say about the precision, because like we had that a couple of years ago when Max crashed there in was it an FP3 and then didn't actually get to qualify, and he ends up starting from the back of the pack, and that is one of those milestone moments, especially in his career, because he didn't have. I mean, he did pretty good in the race. He made up several positions, but obviously it wasn't where he wanted to be. But then it was that big reset for him at that point in his career, because he goes away for 2 weeks. Then they leave Monaco and they go to Montreal. He shows up in Montreal without his entourage, and then we see Max Verstappen 2.0, and that was just one of those in-your-face moments in his career. And
well, Mark, I
incidentally,
remember 25 years ago, I saw the retrospective when Olivier Patterson
and crashed
when cars finished. Like, it was incredible.
2 weeks ago. So,
Ricardo wins really a few years ago. Amazing victory. Lewis had his temper tantrum there a few years ago.
Yeah.
Lewis only won there twice, right? Ricardo was so it tends to produce some surprise winners and some surprise podiums, and particularly in combination with Canada when it's back to back with Canada. So I think that's healthy for the sport. Like, the sport's not competitively balanced, as we all know. Mercedes has been on an incredible run of 7 years here, where there hasn't been a question from the opening round in terms of which constructor was the best, which car was the fastest. So yeah, give me the odd track where something haywire. There hasn't been a question from the opening round.
Matt, you made a point that I've never thought about before, and it really resonated with me as you're speaking. That concept of having a track that is immediately identifiable when you turn on the TV. That's important, because I'll be honest, I watch every race every year, but if I turned on the TV and it was the Chinese Grand Prix, it's going to take me 20 minutes to figure out where the race is. And to your point as well, because they push, obviously for FIA safety reasons, because they push the walls and the grandstand so far back from the track, you can't taste the atmosphere on TV. In reality, because there probably isn't a lot, simply because the spectators that are there are pushed so far back from the track. So to your point, whether the racing's great, whether the racing's mediocre, it's important because it's identifiable, because it's relatable. And we talked a lot about this in the pre-race segment, which is it's got a rich history, and for that reason alone, there's value in having it on the calendar. And people are going to tune in, and people are going to watch. And I think they can do things with the cars. And obviously 2022, they're going to push the boundaries of what the cars look like in terms of increasing the degree of parity. But I totally agree with you in the sense that the sport needs consistency in terms of relatable events, because if it's all the Chinese Grand Prix, it's too generic. It's like a 1980s video game.
The Monaco Grand Prix is the only Grand Prix my mother can instantly identify. Like, her men have put her through this sport for however long. But the Monaco Grand Prix is one she'll sit and watch, because she sits there and likes the Cartier store and the casino and everything, right? and like, here's the thing, like, putting on a Grand Prix race is a massive logistical achievement. And you were subject to things by virtue of time, space, location, all sorts of reasons, economics, where... And it's hard to get everything perfect. And that's one of the things I've heard about Monaco is it's not really sort of the best crowd or atmosphere race on the calendar. It's hard to get everything perfect. Well, that's okay. And that's one of the things I've heard about Monaco is you want an atmosphere race? Go to Monza. Go to Mexico. Like, they're atmosphere races, right? It looks fantastic on television. God bless the Austria-Germany countryside. Go to Mexico. But it's a long way out from major cities. It becomes logistically difficult for the public to go out there. I have a friend who's into this sport who is a very successful media executive here in Canada, and has ridden buses 2 hours out to watch races from the Red Bull Ring and whatnot. If you're going to have a race in a city, in an urban environment, you're probably going to have to surrender some things that if you had more space, would be more ideal. So, it's narrow. It's narrow at Monaco. It's narrow at Melbourne. So you deal with the idiosyncrasies of every race in every locale. It's narrow. And I, for one, love to see them racing in cities as well as the countryside. And there is no better city to race in from a backdrop point of view and a setting point of view than Monte Carlo. Racing in cities as well as the countryside. And there is no better city to race in from a backdrop point of view and a setting point of view than Monte Carlo.
Well, that's why it makes it such an interesting prospect to be going back to Baku City this weekend, because we talk about some of these iconic corners. I think one of the most bizarre corners I think I've ever seen in my entire life is
there's a damsel in distress.
Wide entrance into that corner by a castle of all things. A castle on a corner.
What the hell is this? There's a damn castle there. They are not like it's got a medieval quality, right? Like the juxtaposition of that machine. However millions this, many millions of dollars, man made everything. Like it's got a medieval. By this like 500-year-old mortar and block castle. It's just magnificent. I love it. Many millions of dollars, man made everything. By this like 500-year-old mortar and block castle. It's just magnificent. I love it.
It's such a stark contrast. You have like this literally space age technology whipping by at 200 miles an hour. You expect somebody to come, galloping out of the front gates of the castle, knight in shining armor on the back of a horse.
I love the variety, and frankly, I've never been to Azerbaijan. I acknowledge hand in here, but no, I love. If there's something in the backdrop of your Grand Prix that is indigenous and can sort of brand your city or brand your country, if there's something in the backdrop, it's 100 million eyeballs once a year. You couldn't afford to buy it advertising-wise, right? Your city or brand your country. So bravo to Baku and to Azerbaijan. Like they have a track and they've attracted a race that number one has provided some really great drama. It's been fun racing there. And to over brief history, but also has something distinctive and relatable about it, the castle, that sort of distinguishes it from the rest.
Well, I mean, if you
over brief history, but also has something distinctive and relatable about it, the castle.
Yeah.
That sort of distinguishes it from the rest.
I know Mark wants to jump in here because as soon as you said like some very memorable moments, I know he wants to talk about Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton wheel banging each other behind the safety car a couple of years ago. I know that's where you're going to take it, Mark. Am I correct or no?
Is glorious. It's incredibly unpredictable. It's got tight city streets. It's got the castle as a backdrop. It's got that absurd 2.2 kilometers straight where the cars are going 330 kilometers an hour. It's like it has a little bit of everything, and it's also got some unpredictability. We've seen a manhole cover got sucked up into the bottom, and that was a little unfortunate, but things you don't normally see. And to your point as well, a few years ago on the podcast that I was working on previously, we did a poll, and the poll was very honestly, have you ever heard of Baku before Formula One went there? 90% of our listeners had never heard of it. The other 10% were lying, straight up lying. So as a marketing exercise, this is invaluable for a country. And to your point, Mark, I think some of the most interesting moments from the last couple of years happened there, whether it was Danny Ricciardo driving into the back of Max Verstappen or Lance Stroll taking a podium, but losing second place like meters away from the finish line. And Lewis allegedly brake-checking Seb, who then bounces into the side of him, and Perez having a couple of great podiums. There's been so much great stuff, and we've only had 4 races there. It's absolutely crazy.
And Mark, you look at the circuit map, and there's like a hexagon followed by that absurd straight you're talking about. Like it almost looks like the symbol for male or female. Like I sit there and I can't conceive of driving it, given how it's just. Almost looks like one of these things is not like the other in terms of when you look at all the circuit maps over the course of the year. Baku stands out. It stands out there too. I love the fact that we have this sort of stretch in the calendar, and my understanding is Miami's going to go into this spot too, like somewhere around here with Canada, Baku, and Monaco, where you're racing in cities and. In terms of Canada and the Canadian Grand Prix, like first of all, Circuit Gilles Villeneuve is a fantastic track. But the other amazing thing that we have going for our Grand Prix, and it's the single most attended sporting event in Canada every year, non-pandemic. It's 125,000 people there every year. Like it absolutely dwarfs the next biggest sporting event in our country. And of course, we never have 100 million eyeballs on our country sporting-wise either. So all those things apply to us too, Mark, in terms of a marketing play that Baku and Azerbaijan has. Is, this is a man-made island in the basin of the St. Lawrence River, and it looks out onto the skyline of downtown Montreal. Like, it's an incredible marketing tool for that city and for our country. And as someone whose family, all grew up there, and still there are familial home. For that city. and for our country. You couldn't conceive of the city without the Grand Prix. You couldn't conceive of what tourism would be like without the Grand Prix. I am glad this pandemic is nearly over because I endeavor to go see some of these races. And drag my girlfriend like the two of you have dragged. I am glad this pandemic is nearly over because I endeavor to go see some of these races. And drag my girlfriend like the two of you have dragged.
Wait. But before we wrap it up and get some predictions here, it's funny you should say that because when I was watching, the 500 last weekend, it was such a stark contrast because I'm watching, the race. I'm watching Helio Castroneves win the Indy 500, 130 or 40,000 people in the stands at Indianapolis. And then afterwards, I go down to the grocery store here in Port Moody. I got my mask on and, I'm cringing every time somebody comes within 50 feet of me, right? It's such a weird world that we live in now. But you're just going back to Baku now. Again, a very unique track in and of itself. We've been there 3 times, 3 different winners, no repeat winners. We had Ricciardo win in 2017 in the first edition. Then we had Hamilton and Bottas. Last year we had no Azerbaijan Grand Prix. Again, it is one of the longest tracks on the circuit at just over 6 kilometers or 3.73 miles. It's a shorter in total laps that we run, only 51 laps. I'm just curious, what kind of race are you expecting this weekend, guys? And this one for me is different because it's not quite as tight and as short as Monaco, but it's not a full-on, purpose-built track either. It's sort of a bit of a hybrid in between. So I don't know if this is more advantage Mercedes or advantage Red Bull. So I'll be honest, when trying to figure out who's going to be good at this
first
one.
First of all, Mark and Mark,
I know it's not going to be Ferrari. I think they had their moment to shine at Monaco. So I think it's going to be back between the usual suspects.
The bill's in the mail. The conversation has been so free. I know I'm long-winded. I'm 90 minutes into this conversation. So I'm not going to pretend to know anything about the way
we agreed on that hourly rate beforehand. So
I know what could happen here. What I will say and what I will hope, and Hamilton hit it, was, Lance nearly had a second here once upon a time. So hopefully that Aston Martin momentum, if you can call it that, from Seb's finish in Monaco, continues here. Because I'd like this to be a broader sort of field of contenders for the podium this week. But I was going to say, we're 90 minutes in here. We haven't once mentioned the battle at the top with Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen. That Verstappen is the driver's leader, that Red Bull is the constructor's leader. Like, honestly, shame on us. We have hit some topics here, but haven't hit the big enchilada. I am just so hopeful that we see these two magnificent drivers, and they are magnificent drivers, but haven't hit the big enchilada. Like when I would bet right now, when it's all said and done, that Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen will be top 5 all-time drivers. Lewis already there, obviously. But I think Max will get there too. He's just a marvelous. I would bet right now, when it's all said and done, that Lewis Hamilton. I really hope we see them going toe to toe in whatever order. Somebody asked me today on Twitter when they heard I was doing your podcast, like, "Oh my God, I've been listening to your show for 10 years. You're an F1 fan. Who do you root for?" I said, I don't really root for any team. I root for drivers. Obviously, I root for the Canadians. But I root for Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen. Who do you root for? To have an absolute Donnybrook throughout the year. I root for drivers. For this to be a dogfight right down to the end, toing and throwing back and forth. To have an because it's been so interesting. We all know the Mercedes doesn't run great when it's not out front, the dirty air. It's not designed, as they say, to pass people. It's designed to run ahead of people. Because and Max is the opposite, right? Like Max is very comfortable chasing the rabbit and going for that pass. So I love the fact that we have not only both drivers playing to their strengths, but also in the reverse roles now, right? To see how they handle it Lewis is the chaser. Max is the jackrabbit. So I'm just hopeful that what we've seen through the first 5 weeks here extends to see how they handle 17 more races, however many it is, through this season. And if it's to happen at the castle and in Baku on the tight circuit and with the ridiculous straight and the tight corner and like everything that this track has to offer, I'm all for it. Happen at the castle and in Baku on the tight circuit and with the ridiculous straight and the tight corner and like everything that this track has to offer, I'm all for that.
Mark, you look like you're coming up with like a well thought out response to that. Right? I see the gears turning in your head as you're doing all the math here, how this is going to work out.
We all want that battle, especially between these two drivers, because on the one hand, Max winning would validate him as an all-time great. Lewis winning in a really tight competition would once again validate him as an all-time great, because, hey, you've had a great car, but now you got to go toe-to-toe with somebody with a car that is of an equivalent package. I think it would validate both of them, but all of us would benefit if this goes down to the wire. If the championship's decided in July, the season's a write-off. And I don't think that's going to happen, but hopefully this goes right down to the wire, and we're still tuning in at Australia and Saudi for Jeddah and for Abu Dhabi. But I think this weekend, I just feel like Red Bull has that car dialed in. Sergio Perez has had a lot of success at this track. He's secured a couple of podiums, especially after last Sunday. He seems more comfortable in that car than he had in any previous weekend. I feel like it could be a big weekend for the Red Bull team, and hopefully for Bottas as well. You know what? I'm not the biggest Bottas fan. He's a great guy. He doesn't deserve the bad luck he's had this year. That pit fiasco, that was unfortunate. I don't assign any blame to him. Being taken out by Russell in week 2, that was tough. But hopefully, as much as I want a close Drivers' Championship, I want a close Constructors' Championship as well, because then it's not so much just about talking about Max and Lewis, but what's happening between Valtteri and Sergio, because one of the two of them is going to help decide the Constructors' Championship.
Well, and Mark, what I would interject, and if I'm not mistaken, Daly put it on the notes. We just haven't gotten to it yet.
One of the two of them is going to help decide.
Is Valtteri in that Mercedes all year? And Mark, what I would, because I've seen the stuff on Russell wanting to know by summer break. Quite frankly, I think it's been 3 years in a row now where Valtteri's won a race or been close to winning a race early in the season, or been felled by some sort of awful.
It's a great question, isn't it?
Frankly, I think Bottas isn't a contender. Russell is a contender. And I can understand how there's politics involved here. Mercedes wants Lewis to be the lead driver again this year. But can we imagine how great it would be if Russell's in the other Mercedes at some point later this year? That could be amazing. Because to me, that's the 4 best drivers the two teams have had. Can we imagine how great it would be in some time? Like that would get me really excited, because a push from below for Lewis on top of the push with, to me, that's Max. Like, you're 7-time world champion. Let's put you in the hot water and see if you're a teabag still, right? Like, let's see if you can handle it. Push from below. I would love to see those storylines later this season. And frankly, I think Russell is just better than Bottas right now.
Prove it.
Let's put you in the hot water and see if you're a teabag still, right? Like, let's see if you can handle it. I would love to see those storylines later this season. And frankly, I think Russell is just better than Bottas right now.
Yeah, it is interesting too, because there was that story that was circulating this week that after that debacle, that pit stop in Monaco, that I think Toto Wolff was saying, Valtteri didn't stop 100% on his marks or something like that, and then so the wheel gun went on there crooked, and then that shredded the wheel nut and everything like that. And Bottas, he said, no, well,
I'm not sure if I totally buy that from Toto. That said, Murray Walker,
so I'm
Michael
kind of wondering,
Schumacher,
is this the first kind of
millimeter
like public,
perfect, right?
building the foundation to kind of let him down slowly, right?
And then, the other thing I read is that Toto really got into Russell for the accident with Bottas at Imola. And frankly, that was George's fault. Like, he got side by side, and he lost his nerve a little bit. It wasn't Valtteri's fault. It was George's fault. And I think George knew it. And I think George knew it even before he hit the barrier. And frankly, that was George's fault. And I think he was so rebellious about it on the radio, screaming at Bottas because he knew it. And I think Martin Brundle was great to point that out on the broadcast. Before he hit the barrier. But, that Toto was all over him about that, to me is a signal. About it on the radio, like, me, that, because he knew it. And I think Martin Brundle was Toto wants George to be the next one. Toto wants George in that Mercedes sooner rather than later. To me is a signal. And that George sort of messed up in a moment of big pressure. Toto got all over him. To be the gives me a little bit of an insight in terms of the timetable here. That George sort of messed up in a moment of big pressure. George into a Mercedes. And Toto got all over. And, I think it happens this year. I do think it happens this year. I think you're going to get to the point like Albon in a Red Bull. And like Gasly in a Red Bull. And where you just cannot sacrifice the second car. I think you're going to get as often as the current driver is sacrificing points in the second car, and like Gasly, to get to the team goals. Like Horner said something on Drive to Survive about Albon, where he said, "I just can't remember the last time he's done the job." As often as the qualified on the second row, finished fourth. That's all we're asking. Shit, we're not asking you to get the team goals. We're asking you to win maximum points as the second car. And I think Valtteri's going to have an issue with that as this year goes along. Qualified on the second row, finished fourth. That's all we're asking. Shit, we're not asking you to win the race.
Yeah.
We're asking you to win maximum points as the second car. And I think Valtteri's going to have an issue with that as this year goes along.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder that the more that Red Bull's able to apply the pressure with that second car and Sergio Perez to that maybe force Mercedes' hand a little bit into making that decision, because, as Wolf always says, we're not here chasing wins, we're chasing perfection.
Can he give some to Aston
they want to
Martin
be as perfect as possible, and
he
which
can have his
I guess is an admirable thing, goal to have. If you're trying to be perfect, but they don't like to live.
Wins, can he give some to Aston Martin and Lance Martin? He can have his perfection. If we get a Canadian win, I'd be happy with that, fellas.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, Matt, I think this is a good place to tie it up nicely. We promised we were going to just keep you for an hour. It's been about 7 hours and 38 minutes, but if I look at the counter here, so we appreciate you hanging out. Again, really thrilled that you're able to come and hang out with us. And again, congratulations on you and Blake, and I'd like to say the new show, but the revived show. So before we let you go, just let everybody know where they can follow you guys online.
I know we're building a studio right now,
this
so
isn't as nearly as
we're at a
luxurious
temporary
or,
location as we speak.
As, maybe well appointed as the blanket fort that you guys have.
First of all, fellas, just delighted that we
try our best.
That we have two right such so sophisticated, knowledgeable fans and podcasters on Formula One here in my community of Vancouver, BC, Canada. It's SekeresandPrice.com. It's 3 to 6 p.m. Pacific time each and every day. We're also available on podcast wherever you get your podcasts. I don't necessarily feel like our audiences cross over all that much because, again, I've had a 3 to 4 hour talk show in Canada for 10 years, and we don't talk a ton of F1 because it's just not really what the audience demands here just yet. But let's hope we built it a little bit here tonight, and let's hope the three of us continue to build it here in our hometown, because it's just not certainly we're no Drive to Survive, nor could we be. But I'm happy to indulge all the sort of new fans and the ones that have questions.
Sure.
Who want to continue this conversation and more F1 conversations. But I'm across my social channels at Matt Sekeres on Twitter. We're on Instagram as well at SekeresandPrice. And just delighted to make both your acquaintances. And I hope that, and for some across the world, this will be strange, but some of the races actually come on at night in Vancouver, BC, at 30 p.m. starts or a 12:30 p.m. start. And on those occasions, guys, I'd be delighted to meet up with you somewhere out in the city and knock the glass, and watch and experience the race together. So thanks for having me. 12:30 p.m. start, and on those occasions, guys. I'd be delighted to meet up with
you. Please.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Something tells me that the 26-hour flight to Abu Dhabi is going to go just like that.
It's a pleasure. We'll leave the jet to the airport that time. We'll pick you up in the private helicopter, and we'll do so.
Something tells me that the 26-hour flight to Abu Dhabi is going to go just like that. The conversation that's going to flow, gents. So thanks very much.
Thank you again. Ladies and gentlemen, Matt Sekeres joining us again tonight. And again, if you want to get in touch with us, you can do so on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod, or you can get in touch via the email at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. And that's it. That's a wrap. We will be back in a couple of days to recap the Azerbaijan Grand Prix and whatever drama and excitement unfolds. And until then, have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you guys again in a couple of days. Bye for now. All right, and we're clear.